My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and when I saw my stepsister's name on the screen, I already knew something was wrong. Mara never called that late. She texted, usually, careful and considerate the way she always was, unless something had genuinely rattled her. "Grace," she said, the moment I answered, her voice thin and shaking. "I need to talk to you. Mom did something and I don't know what to do." Part 1. The family we built. My father remarried when I was 14. My own mother had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and for a long time, I resented the idea of anyone stepping into the space she'd left behind, no matter how carefully or gently they tried to do it. Deanne, my father's new wife, brought with her a daughter of her own, Mara, 2 years younger than me, quiet and watchful in those early months, clearly navigating her own version of the same uncertain territory I was standing in. What surprised me, over the years that followed, was how genuinely Mara and I grew close, even as my relationship with Diane herself remained more complicated, more formal, never quite finding the warmth I imagined some blended families manage to build. Diane was polite to me, mostly, in the careful way people are polite to someone they haven't fully decided to love. But Mara and I became real sisters, in every way that mattered: late-night talks, shared clothes, the particular loyalty of two girls who'd both lost something and found, unexpectedly, something like family in each other instead. By the time I was 28 and Mara was 26, we were as close as any sisters I knew, biological or not. She'd been my maid of honor when I married my husband, Theo, 3 years earlier. I was, without question, going to be hers when her own wedding eventually came. That wedding had finally arrived, or was supposed to, in just under 4 months. Mara was engaged to a kind, steady man named Julian, and the two of them had been planning a modest, tasteful wedding for the better part of a year. Nothing extravagant. A celebration that reflected who they actually were as a couple rather than an attempt to impress anyone. I did not expect, going into that Tuesday night, that the wedding itself was about to become the site of a financial crisis that would reveal things about Diane I had spent 15 years not fully understanding. Part 2. The demand. Mara explained, in halting, upset fragments over that late-night call, what had happened earlier that day. Diane had sat her down, not Julian, not the two of them together, just Mara alone, and informed her, in the tone Mara described as unnervingly calm, that she needed $25,000 from Mara and Julian's own savings to properly fund the wedding as it should be done. On top of the budget Mara and Julian had already carefully planned and were managing themselves. She said if we didn't contribute that amount, she couldn't stand behind the wedding, the way a mother should, Mara told me, her voice cracking. She kept using this phrase, stand behind the wedding, like she was threatening not to show up or not to support it publicly if we didn't come up with this money. "Grace, Julian and I don't have $25,000 sitting around. We've been saving for a house down payment. This would wipe out almost everything we've built over the past 3 years." I sat in my own kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling a familiar, complicated knot forming in my stomach. The specific tangle of loyalty to my sister and long-simmering wariness toward Deanne that I'd carried, quietly, for most of the 15 years I'd known her. "Did she say what the money was actually for?" I asked. "25,000 on top of your existing budget is an enormous amount. That's not a normal ask, Mara, even for an extravagant wedding." "That's the thing," Mara said. "She was vague about it. She talked about additional vendor costs and family obligations and doing things properly. But she never gave me an actual breakdown. When I pushed her for specifics, she got defensive, said I was being disrespectful, questioning her judgment about how these things are done. Grace, something about the whole conversation felt wrong. Not just expensive, wrong." Part 3. Digging deeper. I want to be honest about my own history with Diane here, because I think it matters for understanding why Mara's call set off such immediate alarm bells for me, rather than simple confusion. Diane had, over the 15 years I'd known her, developed a pattern, subtle, rarely dramatic enough to constitute an obvious red flag on its own, but consistent enough that I'd quietly noticed it building over the years. She managed money carefully, sometimes secretively, and had, on at least 2 occasions I knew of, asked my father for emergency sums of money for vague purposes that never quite resolved into clear explanations. My father, an easygoing man who avoided conflict whenever possible, generally provided what she asked without much scrutiny, a pattern I'd watched with quiet unease for years without ever feeling it was my place to intervene. This demand, though $25,000, specifically targeted at Mara and Julian rather than at my father, framed as an obligation rather than a request, felt different, more urgent, more specifically troubling. "Has your mom mentioned any financial stress lately?" I asked Mara. "Any hints that something might be going on that she hasn't fully explained?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "Actually," she said slowly, "now that you mention it, a few months ago she mentioned, kind of offhand, that she'd made some investments with a friend from her book club. She didn't go into detail and I didn't ask because it seemed like her own business. But she seemed stressed lately, in a way I couldn't quite place. On edge. I chalked it up to wedding planning stress, but now I'm wondering if it's something else." That detail settled into my stomach with an uncomfortable weight. "Mara," I said carefully, "I think we need to find out exactly what's actually going on before either of you agree to hand over that kind of money." Part 4, What We Found. Over the following week, Mara and I did some careful, cautious digging, not confronting Diane directly yet, but trying to understand the actual shape of what was happening before either of us said anything that might make things more difficult to untangle. Mara, with some guilt but growing certainty that something needed to be understood before any money changed hands, mentioned the situation to her father, my father, and Diane's husband, carefully, without accusation, simply asking if he knew anything about financial pressure Diane might be under. My father's reaction told us most of what we needed to know before he'd even finished speaking. He went quiet, then admitted, reluctantly, that Diane had indeed mentioned an investment opportunity with her book club friend, Patricia, several months earlier. A real estate venture, according to Diane, promising unusually high returns, that she'd convinced him to contribute $15,000 toward, money that had come from their joint retirement savings. "She told me it was performing well," my father said, clearly uncomfortable discussing details he'd apparently never fully understood himself. "I haven't really followed up on it recently, honestly. Diane handles most of our day-to-day finances." That admission set off exactly the alarm I'd been dreading. Mara and I spent the following 2 days doing what research we could, searching for any public information about Patricia's supposed real estate venture, checking business registries, trying to understand whether this was a legitimate investment gone temporarily rough or something considerably more troubling. What we found was alarming. There was no registered business entity matching what Diane had described. Patricia herself, it turned out, had a concerning history. 2 prior small claims judgments against her from other acquaintances alleging unpaid debts related to vague investment opportunities that had never materialized into anything concrete. The picture assembling itself was increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Diane appeared to have been drawn into some version of an investment scam, had already lost a significant amount of money from her and my father's retirement savings, and was now, apparently, attempting to recoup those losses by pressuring Mara and Julian into handing over $25,000 of their own hard-earned savings under the pretense of wedding costs, money that, we increasingly suspected, was never actually intended for the wedding at all. Part 5, The Confrontation. Mara and I decided, after that week of careful research, that the situation needed to be addressed directly, not with accusation, necessarily, but with enough clarity that Diane would understand we knew considerably more than she'd hoped we would. We met at my father's house on a Sunday afternoon, all 4 of us. My father, Diane, Mara, and me, with Julian waiting nearby but not present for the initial conversation, at Mara's request, wanting to handle this specific confrontation as a family matter first. Mara laid out what we'd found carefully, without accusation in her tone, simply presenting the facts. The absence of any registered business matching Patricia's supposed real estate venture, Patricia's history of similar unresolved financial disputes with other acquaintances, and the timeline connecting Diane's sudden, urgent demand for $25,000 to the period immediately following what appeared to be a substantial, unexplained financial loss. Diane's face, as Mara spoke, went through a familiar, unmistakable sequence: initial defensiveness, then a flicker of something closer to panic as she realized how thoroughly we'd already pieced things together. And finally, after a long, heavy silence, something that looked almost like relief, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a secret alone for too long and finds, however uncomfortably, a strange comfort in it finally being seen. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," Diane said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it in 15 years of knowing her. Patricia seemed so credible. She showed me documents, projected returns, everything looked legitimate. I invested our savings because I genuinely believed it would grow into something significant enough to help with Mara's wedding, enough to help all of us, honestly. When the returns stopped coming and Patricia stopped answering my calls, I panicked. I didn't know how to tell your father I'd lost $15,000 of our retirement savings to what was clearly some kind of scheme. I thought, if I could get the wedding money from Mara and Julian instead, I could quietly use part of it to cover what I'd lost, and no one would ever need to know how badly I'd been fooled. The room went very quiet. My father, hearing the full shape of what had happened for the first time, looked genuinely stricken, not primarily angry in that first moment, but hurt in the specific way of a man realizing his wife had carried a serious financial crisis alone, rather than trusting him enough to face it together. "Diane," he said slowly, "you were going to take money from Mara and Julian, money they've been saving for a house, to quietly cover a loss you never told me about, instead of just telling me the truth." "I was ashamed," Diane said, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw something genuinely vulnerable cross her face, something beneath the careful, controlled exterior she'd maintained the entire time I'd known her. "I've always prided myself on managing our finances well. Admitting I'd been fooled this badly, that I'd lost that much money to something so obviously, in retrospect, too good to be true, I couldn't face telling you. And then the wedding was coming up, and it felt like an opportunity to fix things quietly, without anyone ever needing to know how badly I'd failed." Part 6, sorting through the wreckage. The weeks that followed were difficult in a different way than I'd initially anticipated. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd half expected, but a slower, more complicated process of a family working through genuine hurt, financial anxiety, and the particular challenge of rebuilding trust after a serious breach of honesty, even one rooted more in shame and panic than in deliberate cruelty. My father and Diane sought financial counseling together, working through both the practical rebuilding of their depleted retirement savings and the deeper communication issues that had allowed Diane to feel she couldn't simply tell her husband the truth about a serious financial mistake. My father, to his credit, focused less on anger at the initial loss, which, after all, had come from genuine, if naive, trust in someone who turned out to be running a scam, and more on the deeper hurt of Diane choosing concealment and a plan to quietly extract money from Mara rather than honest partnership in facing the problem together. Mara and Julian did not, ultimately, contribute the $25,000, and Diane, once the full situation was out in the open, never asked again, clearly recognizing how inappropriate and ultimately dishonest the original demand had been. Their wedding proceeded as originally planned, on the budget they'd carefully built themselves, without the additional financial strain that could have genuinely derailed their future together. Diane and I, somewhat unexpectedly, found a slightly different footing with each other in the aftermath, not a dramatic transformation into closeness, exactly, but a small, meaningful shift. She thanked me quietly, a few weeks later, for how Mara and I had handled the confrontation. Directly, but without cruelty, giving her room to explain rather than simply condemning her the moment the facts became clear. "I know I haven't always made things easy between us," Diane told me, during one of the more honest conversations we'd ever had in 15 years of knowing each other. "I think I was always a little intimidated by how close you and Mara became, how naturally it happened, when my own relationship with you always felt more effortful." I'm sorry that insecurity, among other things, contributed to a situation where I nearly hurt both my daughters trying to hide a mistake instead of trusting any of you with the truth. I didn't fully resolve 15 years of complicated feelings in that single conversation, and I don't think either of us expected that. But it was, genuinely, a start, an honesty between us that had never quite existed before, born, strangely enough, out of a crisis that could have just as easily destroyed whatever fragile goodwill existed between our blended family instead of, unexpectedly, deepening it. Part 7. Pursuing Patricia. While the family situation slowly stabilized, my father, with Diane's full cooperation this time, pursued legal action against Patricia, working with an attorney who specialized in investment fraud cases. It turned out my father and Diane were not Patricia's only victims. The investigation eventually uncovered at least 6 other acquaintances from various social circles who had been drawn into similar schemes over the preceding 3 years, losses totaling well over $200,000 across all the victims combined. Patricia was eventually charged criminally, in addition to facing the civil suits filed by multiple victims, including my father and Diane. The criminal case, when it finally concluded over a year later, resulted in a conviction and a restitution order, though my father and Diane, like most of Patricia's victims, ultimately recovered only a fraction of what they'd originally lost. A common, frustrating reality in these kinds of fraud cases, where the money has typically long since been spent by the time any legal resolution arrives. Epilogue. Mara and Julian's wedding took place, as planned, 4 months after that panicked late-night phone call. It was exactly the kind of celebration they'd originally envisioned, modest, warm, genuinely reflective of who they were as a couple, entirely unburdened by the financial crisis that had briefly threatened to derail it. I gave a toast that evening, standing beside my sister in a way that 15 years earlier, as a grieving 14-year-old resenting a stranger stepping into my mother's old role, I could never have imagined. I talked about the strange, unexpected ways families sometimes form. Not always through blood, not always smoothly, sometimes through genuine difficulty and painful honesty, but forming into something real nonetheless. Diane cried during that toast, which surprised me, given how carefully controlled she'd always presented herself over the years I'd known her. Afterward, she found me near the edge of the dance floor and hugged me, briefly but genuinely, the first real hug I could remember receiving from her in 15 years. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for handling this the way you did, for giving me the chance to be honest instead of just being caught." I think often about how close that late-night panicked phone call came to becoming something considerably more destructive. A family fractured by a secret desperate enough to nearly cost Mara and Julian their entire savings, built on top of an already fragile blended family dynamic that could easily have shattered under that additional strain. Instead, somehow, it became the opposite. The moment a 15-year-old, carefully maintained distance between Diane and me finally, imperfectly, began to close, built not on some easy, effortless closeness, but on the harder, more valuable foundation of a genuine crisis faced honestly, together, once all of us finally stopped pretending everything was simpler than it actually was. Mara and Julian bought their house 8 months later, the down payment fully intact, the $25,000 that almost disappeared into someone else's fraud instead going exactly where it always should have, toward the actual future my sister and her husband were genuinely building together. The end.